The gunner's finger froze on the trigger as the silhouette banked hard through the clouds. Friend or foe? In that split second, with adrenaline screaming through his veins and tracers already lighting up the sky around him, Staff Sergeant Vincent Caldwell had to decide. The shape was wrong, the angle impossible to read, and the formations scattered across the German sky offered no answers. What happened next would haunt every man aboard that B-17 for the rest of their lives, and reveal a hidden war being fought not against the enemy but against their own brothers in arms. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. March 14, 1944. The air above Schweinfurt, Germany, trembled with the thunder of 300 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, their contrails etching white scars across a slate-gray sky. Inside the waist gun position of a bomber designated Red Queen, Vincent Caldwell pressed his face against the frigid metal frame, his breath forming crystals on the oxygen mask that kept him conscious at 23,000 feet. The temperature hovered at 40 degrees below zero. His fingers, even through heated gloves, ached with a bone-deep cold that made every movement deliberate and slow. Around him the tight combat box formation stretched in every direction, a defensive shield of overlapping fields of fire designed by tactical minds who understood that survival meant staying close, staying disciplined, staying aware. Each bomber carried 10 men, each man responsible for a specific task that kept the machine airborne and deadly. Ball turret gunners hung suspended beneath the fuselage in their glass spheres, tail gunners crouched in their isolated stations watching the rear, waist gunners like Caldwell scanned the flanks through open windows where the wind shrieked past at 200 miles per hour. The roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines drowned out everything except the occasional crackle of the intercom and the hammering of anti-aircraft shells bursting in black clouds around them. Vincent had flown 11 missions since arriving at the airbase in Suffolk, England, 3 months earlier. He was 22 years old, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never seen an ocean before boarding the troop ship that carried him across the Atlantic. His crew, a collection of strangers thrown together by the machinery of war, had become closer than family. They trusted each other with their lives every time they climbed into Red Queen and turned their noses toward occupied Europe. But today something felt different. The formation seemed looser than usual, the bomber stream stretched thin by headwinds and navigation errors that had scattered groups across miles of hostile airspace. Lieutenant Raymond Ashford, the pilot, fought the controls with steady hands, his voice calm over the intercom, despite the flak bursting close enough to rattle the frame. Navigator Thomas Merrick called out course corrections, his maps and instruments spread across a tiny table in the nose compartment, where the plexiglass allowed him to see the ground far below. Bombardier Jack Holland crouched over his Norden bombsight, calculating wind speed and altitude for the moment when the payload would drop and the formation would wheel away toward home. Radio operator Eugene Cross monitored frequencies, his headset crackling with overlapping voices as group leaders tried to coordinate the scattered attack. The mission briefing that morning had been tense. Intelligence officers had warned them about increased Luftwaffe activity, about new fighter tactics designed to break apart American formations and pick off isolated bombers one by one. German pilots had learned that attacking from head-on negated much of the defensive fire concentrated at the rear and sides of the B-17. They dove through formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, cannons blazing, breaking away before gunners could track them effectively. Other tactics involved shadowing the bomber stream just outside gun range, calling in positions to flak batteries below, waiting for damaged aircraft to fall behind where they could be swarmed and destroyed. But the briefing had mentioned nothing about the other threat, the invisible enemy that flew in American markings and spoke English over the radio. Friendly fire was a phrase whispered in barracks after missions, a dark subject that officers discouraged and crews rarely discussed openly. Everyone knew it happened. Everyone had heard stories. A gunner mistaking a P-47 Thunderbolt for a Focke-Wulf 190 and opening fire before recognizing the white star on the fuselage. A bomber formation fire on another group, approaching from an unexpected angle. Nervous trigger fingers, poor visibility, identification failures, communications breakdowns. The chaos of combat created opportunities for catastrophic mistakes, and those mistakes were killing Allied airmen at a rate that headquarters refused to publicly acknowledge. Vincent had never fired on a friendly aircraft, but he had come close. 2 weeks earlier, during a mission over Frankfurt, a flight of P-51 Mustangs had cut through the formation at high speed, their sleek profiles briefly resembling German Me-109s in the haze and smoke. His finger had tightened on the trigger before his brain registered the shape of the tail, the distinctive roar of the Merlin engine, the paint scheme that marked them as escorts. He had not fired, but the gunner and the bomber flying off their left wing had. The burst was brief, maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough. One of the Mustangs had peeled away trailing smoke, and Vincent had watched it spiral downward until it disappeared into the clouds. No parachute. The pilot, whoever he was, had probably died without ever understanding why his own side had killed him. That memory haunted Vincent as he scanned the sky now, his eyes moving in the pattern drilled into him during training. Check 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 12 o'clock, repeat. Watch for the sun, where enemy fighters love to hide before diving. Watch for contrails forming at high altitude. Watch for anything that moved wrong, appeared suddenly, or broke the geometry of the formation. His gun, a Browning M250 caliber machine gun mounted on a flexible pivot, could traverse nearly 180 degrees. It was a weapon of immense power, capable of tearing apart a fighter with a single well-placed burst. It was also a weapon of terrible responsibility, because every aircraft in the sky looked like a target, until proven otherwise. The intercom crackled. Ashford's voice, tight with tension, cut through the engine roar. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Looks like a dozen, maybe more. Gunners, stay sharp.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Vincent swung his weapon toward the indicated position and saw them immediately, black specks against the pale sky growing larger as they closed the distance. Focke-Wulf 190s, their radial engines unmistakable even at this range. They were forming up for a head-on pass, the most dangerous attack profile because it gave gunners only seconds to engage before the enemy flashed past. The ball turret gunner, a wiry kid from Ohio named Danny Fletcher, called out range estimates. The top turret gunner, Sergeant Carl Jenkins, rotated his position to cover the high angle. Everyone was talking at once, voices overlapping, adrenaline sharpening every word. The Germans came in fast, their 20mm cannons winking as they opened fire. Tracers arced through the formation, bright streaks of red and orange that seemed to move in slow motion until they snapped past with terrifying speed. The B-17 shuddered as rounds punched through the thin aluminum skin, the sound like hammers striking sheet metal. Vincent fired, his gun bucking against his shoulder, the smell of cordite filling the cramped waist compartment. Shell casings tumbled to the floor, clinking and rolling with the motion of the turf. The vibration traveled up his arms, numbing his hands, but he kept his finger on the trigger, walking his fire toward a Focke-Wulf that broke left and vanished into the clouds. Then, as suddenly as it began, the attack was over. The German fighters scattered, diving away to regroup for another pass or retreating in the face of concentrated defensive fire. Vincent released the trigger and took a shuddering breath, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Smoke drifted through the waist compartment from a small fire that Cross was already smothering with an extinguisher. The intercom filled with damage reports. Number 3 engine was running rough, losing oil pressure. A hydraulic line had been severed, making the controls sluggish. The tail gunner, a quiet man named Peterson, reported a gash in the vertical stabilizer large enough to see through, but they were still flying. Red Queen was wounded, but she was alive, and so was her crew. Ashford ordered them to tighten up with the formation, to find protection in the overlapping fields of fire that made attacking bombers so costly for the Luftwaffe. Slowly, painfully, the bomber edged closer to the nearest group, sliding into position like a wounded animal seeking the safety of the herd. That was when Vincent saw it. Another formation, approaching from the south at slightly lower altitude. They were B-17s. No question, the distinctive 4-engine silhouette unmistakable even at distance. But something about their approach seemed wrong. They were angling across the flight path rather than paralleling it, their formation loose and disorganized. Vincent frowned, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Were they lost, damaged and trying to rejoin the main stream, or were they simply navigating by a different route, converging on the same target from a secondary heading? The intercom crackled again, but this time the voice was unfamiliar. It belonged to another crew, another bomber somewhere in the formation, and the words sent ice through Vincent's veins. Bandits, 8 o'clock low, engaging. Vincent whipped his gun around, searching for the threat, but all he could see were the B-17s. And then, with dawning horror, he understood. Someone in the formation had misidentified the approaching bombers as enemy aircraft. The angle was bad, the visibility poor, the silhouette distorted by haze and distance. To an exhausted, adrenaline-flooded gunner who had just survived a German attack, those B-17s might have looked like Junkers Ju-88 bombers, twin-engine aircraft that the Luftwaffe sometimes used in raids against Allied formations. The sky erupted with tracers. Dozens of guns opened fire simultaneously, streams of 50-caliber rounds converging on the approaching formation. Vincent watched in paralyzed disbelief as the other bombers staggered under the onslaught. One of them nosed over immediately, smoke pouring from its wing, spinning downward in a death spiral. Another broke apart in mid-air, its fuselage splitting as fire consumed the bomb bay. Tiny figures tumbled from the wreckage, parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the gray sky. "Cease fire, cease fire, those are friendlies." Ashford's voice cut through the chaos, desperate and commanding. "Those are B-17s, stop shooting." But the damage was done. The surviving bombers in the misidentified formation scattered, their crews undoubtedly screaming over their own radios, trying to understand why they were being torn apart by their own countrymen. The firing slackened and stopped, replaced by a terrible silence broken only by the drone of engines and the wind howling through Vincent's gun port. He stood frozen, his hands still gripping the weapon he had not fired, staring at the parachutes drifting downward into enemy territory where capture or death awaited the men beneath them. The intercom was chaos now. Pilots arguing, gunners shouting, officers trying to restore order. Someone was sobbing. Vincent realized it was Cross, the radio operator who had a brother flying B-17 SEP with another group. The fear that he might have just watched his brother die was breaking him apart in real time. Ashford kept repeating orders, trying to hold the formation together, trying to keep his own crew from falling into panic or despair. Vincent finally found his voice. "I didn't fire. I didn't fire." He said it to no one in particular, a prayer, or a confession, a need to distance himself from what had just happened. But even as he spoke, he knew it didn't matter. He was part of this formation, part of this mission, part of this war. The guilt was collective, shared by every man who had squeezed a trigger in those terrible seconds when misidentification turned brothers into targets. The bombing run continued because it had to. Orders were orders, and turning back would waste the lives already lost and the fuel already burned. The formation reached Schweinfurt, the ball-bearing factories that fed the German war machine sprawling below like gray tumors on the landscape. Bombs fell, tumbling through the sky in long arcs before erupting in fire and debris. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, black clouds appearing so thick they seemed solid. More bombers fell, burning or exploding, or simply disintegrating under direct hits. Vincent watched it all through a haze of numbness, his mind unable to process the overlapping layers of horror. When Red Queen finally turned for home, limping on 3 engines with a dozen holes punched through her skin, Vincent remained at his gun position even though the immediate threat had passed. He stared at the empty sky, at the contrails dissolving in the high-altitude winds, at the distant horizon where England waited. His hands shook, his jaw ached from clenching his teeth. And in his mind, over and over, he saw those B-17s breaking apart, saw the parachutes falling, saw the faces he would never know belonging to men he had helped to kill. This was the hidden war, the one that statistics never fully captured and official reports carefully obscured. This was friendly fire, the fratricidal nightmare that turned every mission into a gamble not just against the enemy, but against fear, exhaustion, and the fundamental chaos of combat. And for Vincent Caldwell, and thousands like him, it was a burden that would never fully lift, a guilt that would shadow every memory of the war they had fought and survived. The question was not whether friendly fire was common, the question was how anyone could fly through that hell and emerge with their sanity intact. The answer, Vincent was beginning to understand, was that many of them did not. The debriefing room at the airbase in Suffolk smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke and wet wool. Crews filed in one by one, their faces drawn and pale, their flight suits still stiff with cold. Intelligence officers sat behind long tables with typewriters and notepads, ready to extract every detail of the mission, while memories were fresh and reactions unfiltered. Vincent sat in a wooden chair near the back, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he had not yet tasted. Across from him, Cross stared at nothing, his eyes red-rimmed and vacant. The rest of Red Queen's crew occupied nearby seats, maintaining the physical proximity that had kept them alive at altitude, but unable to bridge the emotional distance that the day's events had opened between them. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Harmon entered the room, his uniform crisp despite the late hour, his face carved from the kind of granite that high command seemed to produce in inexhaustible quantities. He was the group operations officer, responsible for planning missions and evaluating performance, a man who measured success in tons of bombs dropped and losses kept within acceptable parameters. His eyes swept across the assembled crews, tallying the empty seats where men should have been sitting, calculating the cost of the day's operation with the cold efficiency of an accountant. Harmon did not waste time with pleasantries. "Gentlemen, today's mission achieved its primary objective. Reconnaissance will confirm the extent of damage to the target facilities, but preliminary reports indicate significant disruption to enemy production capacity. However, we also experienced higher than anticipated losses." He paused, consulting a sheet of paper on the table before him. 14 bombers failed to return. 3 more are written off due to damage. Casualty figures are still being compiled. Vincent felt the words like blows. 14 bombers, 10 men per aircraft, 140 lives, give or take the few who might have survived bailouts or crash landings. Some of those men had been killed by flak, some by German fighters, and some, Vincent knew with sickening certainty, had been killed by American guns. The debriefings proceeded in order. Each crew called forward to report their observations. Pilots described flak concentrations and fighter tactics. Navigators explained course deviations and wind patterns. Bombardiers estimated the accuracy of their drops. Gunners recounted engagements, claiming kills that would be verified or dismissed based on corroborating evidence and gun camera footage. The process was mechanical, designed to extract data while minimizing emotion, a necessary ritual that transformed chaos into charts and statistics. When Ashford stood to represent Red Queen's crew, his voice was steady but his eyes betrayed the strain. He described the German attack, the damage to their aircraft, the struggle to maintain formation integrity. Then he hesitated, glancing back at Vincent and the others before continuing. "Sir, there was an incident involving possible misidentification of friendly aircraft. Approximately 14:30 hours, a formation of B-17s approached from the south at lower altitude. Multiple aircraft in our group engaged them before the error was recognized and fire was ceased." The room went silent. Every man present understood what those words meant, but speaking them aloud transformed a whispered fear into official record. Harmon's expression did not change, but his pen moved across the notepad with increased pressure, underlining words that would later find their way into reports submitted up the chain of command. "How many aircraft were hit?" Harmon asked. "At least 3 confirmed, possibly more," Ashford replied. 2 went down immediately, the others scattered. "I don't know their final disposition." "Which crews opened fire?" "I can't say with certainty, sir. It happened fast. Someone called out bandits and the formation responded." "Did your crew engage?" "No, sir. We recognized them as friendlies before firing." Harmon nodded, making another note. "This matter will be investigated. Gun camera footage will be reviewed. Radio logs will be examined. If specific individuals are identified as having initiated the engagement, appropriate action will be taken." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. "However, I want to be clear. Misidentification under combat conditions is a known risk. Gunners are trained to respond to threats instantaneously. The enemy exploits our formations, our call signs, even our aircraft markings when circumstances allow. Every man in this room understands that hesitation can be fatal. What happened today is a tragedy, but it is also a consequence of the environment in which we operate." Vincent wanted to stand, to shout that it was not acceptable that men had died because someone panicked or failed to properly identify a target, but he remained seated, silent, knowing that his anger would accomplish nothing. The machinery of war had no interest in individual guilt or moral outrage. It needed crews to keep flying, to keep bombing, to keep accepting losses as the price of eventual victory. Dwelling on friendly fire would erode morale, undermine confidence, and potentially paralyze men whose reflexes needed to remain sharp if they were to survive the missions still ahead. The debriefing continued for another hour. By the time Vincent stumbled out into the cold English night, exhaustion had replaced anger. He walked across the muddy field toward the Nissen hut that served as his barracks, his boots squelching with each step, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Inside, a coal stove provided minimal warmth against the damp chill that seeped through the corrugated metal walls. Other gunners and crew members occupied bunks or sat around makeshift tables playing cards, writing letters, or simply staring into the middle distance with the hollow-eyed fatigue that defined life between missions. Vincent collapsed onto his bunk without removing his flight suit. Sleep came quickly but brought no rest. In his dreams he was back in the waist gun position, watching formations approach from impossible angles, pulling the trigger over and over while aircraft exploded and men fell burning from the sky. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cold, his heart hammering in his chest. Around him, others tossed and muttered in their sleep, fighting their own private wars against memories that would not fade. The truth about friendly fire was beginning to crystallize in Vincent's mind through conversations overheard and experiences shared. It was not rare, it was not exceptional. It was a constant, pervasive threat that shadowed every mission and claimed lives with a frequency that official records systematically downplayed. The reasons were complex, rooted in the fundamental nature of aerial combat and the limitations of human perception under extreme stress. Aircraft identification was an art as much as a science. Silhouette recognition training used flashcards and models, drilling crews on the shapes of enemy fighters and bombers until they could supposedly identify them at a glance. But combat conditions bore little resemblance to classroom exercises. At altitude, with poor visibility, at odd angles in the split second before an attacker opened fire, even distinctive aircraft could appear ambiguous. The Focke-Wulf 190, with its radial engine and stubby fuselage, could briefly resemble the American P-47 Thunderbolt. The Junkers Ju-88, a twin-engine bomber, shared certain profile characteristics with the B-25 Mitchell. The Messerschmitt Me-109, when viewed from certain angles, might be confused with the P-51 Mustang. Add to this the problem of markings. White stars on American aircraft were supposed to prevent misidentification, but at distance or in poor light, they were often invisible. The Luftwaffe had been known to paint captured Allied aircraft with German markings, and use them to infiltrate formations, sowing confusion and drawing fire from genuine friendlies. Paranoia about such tactics made gunners, even more trigger-happy, willing to shoot first and verify later, rather than risk allowing an enemy to close unmolested. Communication failures compounded the problem. Radio discipline was supposed to keep frequencies clear for essential transmissions, but in the chaos of combat, everyone talked at once. Warnings about bandits became garbled or misunderstood. Pilots flying on the edges of formations could not always hear what was happening at the center. Time delays between sighting and reporting meant that information was often outdated by the time it reached the crews who needed it most. Then there was the human factor. Fatigue degraded judgment and slowed reaction times. Fear sharpened reflexes, but narrowed focus, creating tunnel vision that missed crucial details. Adrenaline distorted time perception, making seconds feel like minutes and minutes compress into seconds. Crews flew mission after mission with inadequate rest, their nervous systems frayed by repeated exposure to life-threatening stress. Under such conditions, mistakes were inevitable. The marvel was not that friendly fire occurred, but that it did not happen even more often. Vincent learned that other crews had experienced similar incidents. A gunner in another squadron confessed over drinks one night that he had shot down a P-38 Lightning, mistaking its twin-boom design for a German reconnaissance plane. The pilot had bailed out and survived, but the gunner carried the guilt like a stone around his neck. Another man described watching two B-24 Liberator formations open fire on each other after a navigation error brought them together at the same altitude and heading. The engagement lasted less than a minute, but left 4 bombers crippled and dozens of men dead or wounded. Official policy regarding friendly fire was deliberately vague. Investigations occurred, but they rarely resulted in courts-martial or public acknowledgement. The reasoning was pragmatic. Punishing men for mistakes made under combat stress would destroy morale and discourage aggressive defense against genuine threats. Better to classify the incidents as accidents, attribute them to the fog of war, and move forward. The dead were counted among general combat losses, their actual cause of death buried in paperwork that would remain classified for decades. But the crews knew. They whispered about it in the barracks, shared stories during debriefings that never made it into official reports, and carried the knowledge like a secret shame. Every mission brought the possibility, not just of dying at enemy hands, but of killing or being killed by their own side. The psychological toll was immense. Trust, already fragile in an environment where death could come without warning, became even more tenuous. Gunners second-guessed their instincts. Pilots hesitated before maneuvering, fearing they might present an ambiguous profile to nearby aircraft. The invisible enemy wore familiar faces and spoke familiar languages, and that made it infinitely more terrifying than anything the Luftwaffe could field. Vincent began keeping a journal, scribbling entries by flashlight after missions, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. He wrote about the weight of responsibility, the impossibility of perfect judgment, the corrosive effect of guilt on men who had done nothing malicious, but whose actions had nonetheless resulted in catastrophe. He wrote about the absurdity of a war, where survival depended as much on avoiding your own side as defeating the enemy. And he wrote about the growing conviction that someone, somewhere, needed to acknowledge what was happening, and take steps to prevent it. But prevention was easier demanded than achieved. The fundamental problems, misidentification, communication failure, human error under stress, had no simple solutions. Training could be improved, but combat would always exceed the limits of any training regimen. Technology might eventually provide better identification systems, but in 1944, such systems did not exist. Radio equipment was primitive, radar was in its infancy, and visual recognition remained the primary method of determining friend from foe. What could be done, Vincent realized, was to create a culture of accountability and awareness. Crews needed to understand that friendly fire was not a rare aberration, but a persistent threat, requiring constant vigilance. They needed permission to question their perceptions, to hesitate when doubt existed, to communicate uncertainly, rather than acting on assumption. And they needed to know that if they did make a mistake, they would not be scapegoated or abandoned, but supported through the psychological aftermath. Such a culture did not exist in March 1944. What existed instead was a combination of denial, fatalism, and bitter acceptance. Men flew because they had to, they fired when they believed they must, and when the bullets struck friendly aircraft, they lived with the consequences as best they could, carrying the dead weight of those memories through every mission that followed. Vincent's next mission came 3 days later, a raid against marshalling yards in occupied France. As Red Queen climbed into formation and turned toward the English Channel, Vincent took his position at the waist gun and scanned the sky with eyes that now saw threats everywhere. Every aircraft was suspect until proven otherwise. Every shadow held potential catastrophe. And when a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts swept past the formation, their radial engines roaring and their white stars gleaming in the sunlight, Vincent kept his finger outside the trigger guard and forced himself to breathe slowly until they were gone. He did not fire a single round during that mission. The Luftwaffe never appeared, and the only danger came from flak that burst well below the formation. But the tension never left his shoulders, and when they landed safely back in England, Vincent felt no relief, only exhaustion and the grim certainty that the next mission would bring new opportunities for tragedy. The war had become not a struggle against Germany, but a struggle against the darkness inside every frightened man with a gun and a split second to decide who deserved to die. The statistics emerged slowly, buried in classified documents that would remain sealed for decades. Between 1942 and 1945, friendly fire accounted for approximately 12% of all American bomber losses over Europe. That number translated to hundreds of aircraft and thousands of men who died, not at enemy hands but from bullets and shells fired by their own formations. The official records rarely stated this plainly. Death certificates listed combat losses without specifying the source. After-action reports used euphemisms like misidentification incidents or fratricidal engagement when they mentioned the problem at all. The reasons ran deeper than simple human error. Combat box formations placed bombers within killing distance of each other by design, creating overlapping fields of fire that maximized defensive capability but also increased the likelihood of catastrophic mistakes. A single burst fire in panic could sweep across multiple aircraft before the gunner realized his error. The high closing speeds of modern aerial combat compressed decision-making into fractions of a second. Gunners had no time for careful examination, no opportunity for second opinions. They saw movement, evaluated threat, and responded with lethal force trained into muscle memory through thousands of practice rounds. Weather conditions amplified every risk. Clouds obscured formations, separating groups and creating opportunities for bombers to emerge from unexpected angles. Ice on windscreens distorted vision, turning recognizable shapes into threatening shadows. Sun glare blinded gunners at critical moments, reducing aircraft to dark silhouettes against brilliant light where identification became guesswork. Winter missions over northern Europe combined all these factors, creating conditions where friendly fire incidents spiked dramatically compared to summer operations. The psychological dimension proved equally devastating. Crews who survived being fired upon by their own side reported profound disorientation and betrayal. The fundamental assumption that danger came only from the enemy was shattered, replaced by paranoia that made every formation encounter a potential threat. Some gunners became hesitant, freezing when they should have engaged legitimate targets. Others became hypervigilant, seeing enemies everywhere and firing at anything that moved. Both responses degraded combat effectiveness and increased vulnerability to actual German attacks. Vincent witnessed the full spectrum of these consequences during his remaining missions. In April, he watched a gunner in a nearby bomber suffer a complete breakdown after realizing he had killed the crew of a British Lancaster flying in temporary attachment to the American formation. The man simply stopped functioning, refusing to touch his weapon, curling into a fetal position in the waist compartment while his crewmates covered his position and tried to keep him from succumbing to shock. He was evacuated upon landing and never flew again. In May, Red Queen found itself under sustained fire from a formation of B-24 Liberators whose navigation had brought them into the same airspace from an oblique angle. The engagement lasted nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in combat time, during which Vincent and his fellow gunners screamed into their radios trying to identify themselves while simultaneously taking evasive action. Number 2 engine was hit, hydraulic fluid sprayed across the fuselage, and the tail gunner Peterson took shrapnel in his leg. Only when both formations broke away to their separate targets did the firing cease, leaving Red Queen limping home on 3 engines with wounded aboard and rage poisoning every man's thoughts. Command responses remained inadequate throughout. New identification protocols were issued requiring visual confirmation through binoculars before engaging any twin-engine, but this was impractical during high-speed encounters. Colored flares were introduced to signal friendly status, but these were easily missed in the chaos of combat or mimicked by resourceful German pilots. Radio code words changed weekly, yet communication failures persisted. The fundamental problem that scared men with powerful weapons made irreversible decisions in microseconds admitted no perfect solution. By summer 1944, Vincent had completed 28 missions. He had seen friends die in fire and explosion. He had killed enemy fighters and watched them spin into the earth. He had bombed cities and factories, transforming abstract coordinates into concrete destruction. But the memories that haunted him most deeply were not of German flak or Luftwaffe attacks. They were of that March afternoon when American guns tore apart American bombers, and of the parachutes falling into enemy territory, carrying men whose names he would never know. The war against Germany would end in victory. The war against the fratricidal nightmare of friendly fire would never truly be won, its casualties forever marked as acceptable losses in the brutal mathematics of total war. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.